Hello, everyone, and welcome to this review of Jordan B. Peterson's latest book, We Who Wrestle With God, Perceptions of the Divine. In this review, I'll be discussing the book from a few different angles, starting with the physical layout of the book and moving into an analysis of some of its deeper themes. If you follow Jordan Peterson for some time, and if you read the comments to his YouTube videos, you'll probably know that Peterson's audience has mixed feelings about his foray into Christianity. Some think Peterson's gone too far into religion and that he should have stayed in the camp of the more atheistic scientific community, while others think he's not going far enough into Christianity, and these folks wish to see Peterson convert to a major denomination like Protestantism or Catholicism and proclaim faith in the literal truth of the Bible. If you're interested at all in this debate and interested to know how this latest book engages this debate, then I hope you'll stay tuned. My name is Fraser Alexander Johnson, host of the School of the West YouTube channel. If you're not already following this page, please go ahead and subscribe. And if you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up and leave a comment with your thoughts. Lastly, if you're interested in an original novel inspired by Homer's Odyssey, you can click the link in the video description or my bio to purchase my own epic fantasy book, The Lost King. And you can also find a link in the description to my recent academic paper published through Mythlore titled The Catholic Imaginations of J.R.R. Tolkien and Oscar Wilde. Thanks, everyone. All right, so let's dive into We Who Wrestle With God. Starting with the physical layout of the book, it's definitely much longer than Jordan Peterson's other works, 12 Rules for Life, which comes in at 409 pages, and Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, which is 432 pages in length. We Who Wrestle With God is 544 pages in total. 493 of those are the actual text of the book. The font is small, but not so small that it will overstretch your eyesight or anything, but it definitely makes those 493 pages seem just a bit longer. The highlight of this book's layout, in my opinion, is that each of the book's 9 chapters features an engraving by Gustave Doré depicting a scene from the biblical story that the chapter is about. This was a great choice in my opinion. These engravings look stunning and they lend the book a very serious, almost epic tone. All in all, it's a handsome volume, and I think the purple coloring is a very nice touch. As I mentioned before, the book is divided into 9 chapters, each one focusing on a major story from the Old Testament. While quotes from the New Testament are sprinkled throughout this book to support Peterson's ideas, he suggested that a forthcoming book will match We Who Wrestle With God and focus on the great stories of the New Testament. Okay, so let's move into a chapter-by-chapter overview, starting with Chapter 1, In the Beginning. In this chapter, Peterson examines the account of creation found in Genesis 1, extrapolating certain fundamental truths about human nature and psychology. In this chapter, he shows us that humanity's place along the great chain of being, us being made in the image of God, gives us our dignity and worth. Peterson reads the account of God's Spirit moving over the face of the deep, or Tehom, as representative of mankind's need to face what he calls a horizon of future. We face this mysterious horizon of possibility with the same creativity that Adam displays in naming the fauna of Eden and establishing God's garden. Chapter 2, Adam, Eve, Pride, Self-Consciousness, and the Fall, is a much more far-ranging chapter. Of most importance here is Peterson's exploration of Adam and Eve and the way that they typify their respective sex. So, for example, the sin of woman, according to Peterson, is Eve's over-inclusivity, since in her maternal empathy, Eve feels that she can safely incorporate the serpent into her care. Man's sin, conversely, and according to Peterson, is Adam's attempt at mastery over too much, biting off more than he can chew. Peterson concludes the chapter by discussing how sin, as expressed in Genesis, is a kind of overreach and how sacrifice is necessary for progress. Chapter 3, Cain, Abel, and Sacrifice, is probably Peterson's most recycled content for those who listen to his podcast regularly. Here he talks at length about how Cain is the archetype of resentment, embodied by the radicals that threaten to destroy Western culture. But again, if you've listened to Peterson and all, you've probably heard the content in this chapter. Chapter 4, Noah, God as the Call to Prepare, looks at Noah's decision to heed God's warning of the flood as a kind of intuition rather than some sort of heroic stand for a particular doctrinal position. And this is one of those instances where I think Peterson is going to confuse Reformed Christians and other Protestant groups. He also interprets the curse of Ham as the punishment for neglecting the wisdom of one's elders. Chapter 5, The Tower of Babel, God versus Tyranny and Pride, interprets the story of Babel as a warning against technological advancement and the moral decline that usually follows in tandem. Chapter 6, Abraham, God as a spirited call to adventure, interprets the stories of Abraham as a model for the journey out of infantile safety and into the wild of freedom and adulthood. Once free to journey, we are faced with a series of choices. The more we choose to sacrifice our narrow self-interests for the good of the community and for our own future good, the more we mature and accrue rewards. In Chapter 7, Moses 1, God as Dreadful Spirit of Freedom, Peterson looks at the first part of Moses' story for valuable lessons about following one's true calling, about orienting oneself to the cosmic order, about telling the truth in the face of tyranny, and about subsidiarity or delegation as the key to a successful civilization. In Chapter 8, Moses 2, Hedonism and Infantile Temptation, Peterson tackles the issue of the so-called jealous, vengeful Old Testament God head-on, interpreting God's wrath in the Old Testament as a warning against godlessness and straying from the moral order. He has an extended discussion in this chapter on the poisonous serpents that the Israelites encounter in their desert wanderings that I found very interesting. And by the way, this is a discussion that was previewed in Peterson's recent debate with Richard Dawkins. The final chapter, Chapter 9, Jonah and the Eternal Abyss, examines, you guessed it, the story of Jonah for wisdom about how to be an honest citizen, essentially. Jonah's flight from God and destiny is, according to Peterson, comparable to the silent citizen in a totalitarian state, but the whale sequence proves that there is redemption for such people. Okay, so now that we have a better understanding of the overall content of the book, we can take a closer look at some themes that stood out to me. The first, and I think the most controversial, is Peterson's refusal to make any kind of doctrinal stance about biblical Christianity. While some Christians are right to be curious or skeptical about Peterson's Christianity, there are a few reasons to defend Peterson's position in this book. Firstly, before we get up in arms about Peterson, we have to take a step back from the text and ask a series of questions, like, who is this book written for? What kind of claims about Christianity and the Bible does Peterson actually make? What kind of central idea or thesis is actually being delivered? And I think that answering these questions will help Christians to lower their pitchforks a bit and understand where Peterson's coming from. So who is this book written for? Well, as I read the book, it soon became obvious that Peterson isn't really, as far as I can tell, writing this book for Christians. In other words, this isn't a book of theology in any way, so those who might be worried about Peterson making flippant theological commentary can rest easy. Peterson's main audience, at least those against whom he's arguing, are scientific atheists like Richard Dawkins and those who believe the Bible to be a collection of fairy tales and that the biblical worldview is outdated. So those are who Peterson is addressing in this book. He spends a lot of time showing how scientific phenomena actually mirror truths found within the pages of Scripture. So in this sense, we can regard the book more so as a work of apologetics, actually, albeit apologetics written by someone partway down the road of their own conversion to Christianity. What kind of claims about Christianity in the Bible does Peterson actually make? Well, answering this question is likely to upset many fundamentalists or Protestant Christians. For example, on page 103, Peterson explains his theory on biblical truth and the origins of the Bible. He has a theory called distillation, as opposed to the more common Christian idea of divine inspiration. Peterson believes that the truths of the Bible are so profound, not because they were necessarily directly given by God, but because the writers of the Bible recognized these repeating patterns over time, and they distilled truths from these, much like a scientist, extrapolating data from research. But I would remind my fellow believers that Peterson's not fully converted, and his theory of biblical distillation is actually very similar to C.S. Lewis's theory of biblical inspiration found in Reflections on the Psalms, just FYI. Lastly, we can ask ourselves, what is the central theme or idea being delivered in this book? Well, while various iterations of Peterson's thesis are sprinkled throughout the book, I believe we get a very clear statement of the thesis on page 492. There, Peterson writes, quote, "The story of man, woman, and God is not one of power, as asserted by the Marxists, or pleasure, as asserted by Freud, but of the sacrificial sequence of transformation that lifts us upward, reconciles now and then, and reconciles individual and community." End quote. Peterson challenges the dominant literary theories of interpretation, denying that the biblical narratives are about either sex or power. He instead urges us to look at the biblical stories as an instructional guide, following the lives of particular people called by God over time, learning from their mistakes and their triumphs, giving us guidance to face the same obstacles in our own life. Ultimately, Peterson concludes on page 495 by reminding readers that, quote, "What we experience, confront, and wrestle with is a domain of vast possibility. We do that in our capacity as veritable images of God, akin to the Logos, the creative spirit whose actions give rise to the cosmos itself with its goodness of order." End quote. I can already hear the outcry from my Protestant brothers and sisters. What Peterson wants us to know is that being made in the image of God, our choices have a part to play in the unfolding of human history. As if God weaves our lesser strains of music into his greater symphony, an idea present in Tolkien's Silmarillion. This seems to go against much of Protestant theology, especially of the more Calvinistic bent, which stresses doctrines of election and predestination. But we should remember that the great Italian poet Dante Alighieri writes in the Il Convivio about how biblical texts, or any text for that matter, can be understood in four senses. The literal, which, quote, "does not go beyond the surface of the letter," end quote. The allegorical, which is, quote, "hidden beneath the cloak," end quote. The moral, which is the sense that teachers should seek to discover throughout the scriptures. And the anagogic, from the Greek for a climb or ascent, which, quote, "signifies the supernal things of eternal glory," end quote. So what Peterson is doing is biblical exegesis at the allegorical and moral levels, which are important components of biblical interpretation, even if he never ventures into the anagogic realm, which is reserved for more theological discussions. Peterson knows he's not qualified for those kind of discussions. He doesn't really venture there. So what are my final takeaways from this book? Well, firstly, if you follow Peterson closely, meaning if you listen to his podcast episodes and you've watched his special on Exodus or something like that, then you aren't really getting anything new here besides expanded discussion on topics he touches on regularly. Like any good researcher who's trying to make sense of the material he's learning, Peterson knows you have to talk through your ideas in order to better understand them. So he's been using his podcast as a space to discuss these ideas that have been swimming around in his head. I get it. I do that in my own research. But with this in mind, we should, consider that this book might not be written necessarily for his fans, but for people who aren't his fans or who don't believe the same truths he does. So it's more like an apologetics book, something that you'd find C.S. Lewis writing. Though in my opinion, Lewis appeals to the heart, I would say, more so than the mind, though that's debatable. When he does make argumentation appealing to the mind, I think it's more akin to argumentation appealing to experience, like Plato. Peterson appeals to the mind, but it's more from a scientific standpoint. So he's arguing against academia, which he has a long history with. All in all, I found this to be a very enjoyable and thought-provoking book, though. If you know someone who feels science and reason are great stumbling blocks on their road to Christianity, I would really encourage you to suggest this book to them. It wasn't political in any sense, meaning that Peterson doesn't mention Donald Trump once, if that kind of thing rankles you, nor does he really mention any modern politician for that matter. The closest political statements he makes are about history, 20th century history. For any Christians upset by Jordan Peterson writing about the Bible, please keep in mind that the stories in Genesis, apart from their theological nature, are also stories, just like Harry Potter or The Lord of the Rings. Peterson wants scientific atheists to approach these stories as stories and understand the truths contained within these timeless narratives. Instead of being rankled that Peterson has not adopted your particular doctrinal stance, choose to view this book as a stepping stone along the pathway to true faith for both Peterson and his audience. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to School of the West. Let me know your thoughts about Jordan Peterson or this book in the comments below. And again, if you're looking for the next great high fantasy read, please consider purchasing my novel, The Lost King, linked in the description of this video. Or if you'd like something more academic and Tolkien-focused, check out my recent Mythlore article, also linked below. Thanks for watching, everyone. Until next time.